Hi, my name is Ricarda Tziontas. I'm Artistic Director of Nordwind Platform and Festival in Berlin. Together with Wayne Ashley, Artistic Director of the FuturePerfect Studio in New York, and Denis Semionov, multimedia artist, I initiated a project that should deal with the digitalization and the performing arts. Then we made an application, we received the money, and February 24th came. We realized that we have to reshape the whole project. We cannot go on just pretending to reflect on the performing arts. Many of the artists that you're going to see today, of the speakers, of the scientists, are in exile. Many are dealing with the topic of exile, of identity, of migration, of finding a new home, of leaving home. We dedicate this project to all the people who are fighting for their rights, from Ukraine up to Belarus, up to Iran, and we wish you all a good conference.
I would like to mention that we have several panels each day, and between them we have small breaks. I'm also going to announce them. And now I'm talking more to the speakers. I will try to control the time and somehow alert you that your time maybe is up, but I think it's going to be smooth. Okay, what we have for today. Now, for today, we have 3 exciting panels. The first one is named Histories of Avant garde and Contemporary Descriptive Technologies. What we should think and what we should think and associate avant-garde with is that this term has 2 meanings. The first one is connected with art movements which were happening in the beginning of the 20th century, so almost 100 years ago. And that is the first meaning of the avant-garde. The second meaning is almost every brand new innovation in art, and in this case, digital art, virtual worlds, NFTs, and all what we're going to talk about here is also an avant-garde. Yet our speakers gonna touch upon this topic from both sides, and it's just gonna be magnificent, believe me. The moderator of our first panel is Lev Manevich. He's an innovator, influencer, and writer. His research interests digital humanities, media art, media theory, and art history. And I'm going to mention that the day after tomorrow, he will also be with us, but not like a moderator, but in role of the panelist. So you better wait also until Friday and stay with us all these 3 days. Among speakers in the first panel, we have Joshua Citarella, who is New York-based artist and researcher. And as he writes about himself in his website, he researches political subcultures. And for today, he's going to give a talk about online memetic culture. You know, these funny pictures with cats, and not only cats, but I prefer cats, honestly. He will talk about how these funny pictures refer to the anti-art of Dadaism, which was one of the avant-garde art movements, and how these memes can be the soil for new ideologies, new radical ideas, wishes, and how they can mirror the interests of the youth. The second speaker of our first panel is Arsen Zhilaev, artist, writer, and political activist. In his art, he tries to investigate and question the legacy of the Soviet Union ideology, and Russian Costumism, which is actually a combination, a cluster of a lot of cultural, philosophical, and artistic programs and beliefs, which can summarize somehow to the ideas of overcoming mortality. He will talk about digitalization of everything, in the sake of management, because he somehow finds the connections with some mathematical theories which were back in the beginning of the 20th century. The third speaker of the first panel is Igor Kraft. He's an interdisciplinary artist, and he is going to also talk about the computerization, but more from the point of view what abilities it gives to us, how it creates new forms of communication, and how the velocity, the speed of it, almost ever increasing, influence on us. That was what we have on the first panel. The second panel is called Intervention, Resistance, Digital Art and Activism. How unpredictable, but wow, I am looking forward to this panel. Because it would be a discussion among artists who use technologies to resist politically and touch upon some very itchy and painful issues for our modern day. The moderator would be Alan Feldman, a cultural anthropologist who studies ethnography of violence, body, and senses. Among speakers, we're going to have Chico McMurtry and Louisa Cornett. Chico is an artist who creates magnificent robotic sculptures and works with new media installations, while Louise is an independent curator. She also works with media art and interdisciplinary practices. They will brief us about public interventions, which help the viewer question the concept of the border. The second speaker going to be Elena Gennadievna. She studied both computer science and cybernetics and new media, so she combines in her even background both technologies and fine arts. She is interested in virtual life, combination of organic and inorganic forms. And in her talk, she is gonna investigate the forms of communication in VR, especially in VR chat, and she'll talk from the prism of female artists from the post-Soviet country, the patriarchal society, and I believe that will be something incredible. Our third speaker for the second panel is Irina Konnikova. She's an artist, writer, and feminist activist. She studies female sexuality in connection with pop resilience and colonial technological practices. She also is a person from with a post-Soviet background, and nowadays she is a curator in Germany, and she'll talk us how she navigates through these uneasy times of conflict and warfare, and how she tries to represent painters and artists from like both sides, and etc. And the last panel for today, but not the least, is digital nomadism and virtual production. I think we all know what digital nomadism is. Digital nomads can work from almost every location in the world. All we need is a laptop, an internet, and maybe a cell phone. Whether maybe this digital nomadism a sign of some very crucial and scary changes, maybe it is more connected with crisis than with welfare. Well, probably we're going to know it from our panelists. The moderator is Anna Schwetz. She is also going to give a talk, but tomorrow. For now, for today, she's a moderator. She's an art historian, curator, and contemporary art lecturer and indicator. We have a pair of speakers in this panel. The first pair, Anna Evtugina and Nikita Shokov. Anna is a creator, producer, and she works with new media exhibitions and international projects. While Nikita Shokov is an artist who works with VR and AR, and they both going to talk about representation of queer identity in digital life, digital sphere, and etc. The second panelist for our last panel today is a film and VR director. Now he's based in Georgia, and he is almost in the middle, in the center of Russian immigrant society. His speech would be dedicated to organization of concerts and performances in VR with while working with an international team. And the last but not the least speaker for today is Team Rolfes, led by Sam and Andy Rolfes. They specialize on spatial performance and experimental motion capture that would be their path in digital art, how they paved from pandemic, economical, and political crisis. That was what we have for today. I think now the moderator can speak instead of me. See you later.
Given the intense and rapid growth of immersive and blockchain technologies, artificial intelligence, and increasing proliferation of digital culture, is it actually useful to talk about these technologies and practices as legacies of a historical avant-garde? So this is the official panel description, and I will get out of the way in a few seconds, but let me literally take 2 minutes and add a few sentences of my own. It's easy to see that the development of so-called modern art and avant-garde, in particular in 1910s and 1920s, was closely connected to the introduction of new media, new technologies. For example, the French Impressionist painters, who basically started the whole idea of modern art by organizing their own exhibitions, were also the first ones to use tube paints, painting from a tube, which revolutionized art's visual language. So even though the paint tubes were invented by an American around 1840, so only this generation of artists were the first one to use it. A bit later, the key avant-garde institutions, such as Russian Bauhaus, such as Russian Futimas and German Bauhaus, were very much focused on developing new visual, spatial, graphic, and typographic languages for the new modern society based on new technologies. And the new media at the time were photography, in particular, very lightweight, and easy to use cameras, somewhat similar to contemporary mobile phones, film. So we have artists who are trying to make experimental abstract films already in the middle of 1910s, motors, metals, and so on. In fact, there is a kind of famous letter written by Klier, who was also teaching Bauhaus, to Kandinsky. They were both painters. In this letter, Klier complains of Maholy-Nash, who was one of the most technologically focused avant-garde artists and professors of Bauhaus. And Klier said there is a constant talk of motors, mobiles, light projectors. And those of us who are committed to painting, to subtlety, to poetry, have a hard time. And I think you can substitute this by names of new technologies, and some of us, like myself, would also complain. I also want to say, and that's the last thing I will say as a moderator, that this idea of digital art or digital cultures of a new avant-garde is definitely not a new one. I don't know who was the first one to propose it, but in my own work, I published an article in 1999, so 23 years ago, called Avant garde software, and we later developed these ideas in my book, The Language of New Media. So already this idea was present at least 23 years ago, and as new technologies, new media, AI, blockchain, and so on appear on the scene, this question remains. Anyway, that's all I have to say. So let me briefly introduce the first panelist, which is Igor Kraft. So Igor Kraft was born in St. Petersburg in 1986. He lives and he works in Tokyo, Vienna, and Berlin. His interdisciplinary practice is informed by media theory, computer science, critical design, philosophy, and art. He is truly a global avant-gardist because he was educated in Rodchenko School in Moscow, Academy of Arts Vienna, Central St. Martin's in London, Tokyo Gidai, and again Strelka Institute in Moscow. He's nominee of various prizes, including Lumen, Innovation, Kandinsky, Humanism. He's a laureate of multiple grants and residencies, such as NTAA Award and S+T+ Arts. And in 2017, he was included in the New East 100 list of Eastern European people in projects shaping our world today by color journals. Welcome, Igor. And I hope my panelists will do their best to stick to the time we agreed, which is around 50 minutes. So we'll have some time at the end, perhaps ask each other a couple of questions and definitely answer questions of the audience. Thank you. Igor.
Thank you, Lev, and hello everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. We didn't do much of a sound check, but it seems okay. So thank you so much for this introduction, Lev. I guess as a practitioner in the first place, I will start with showing my practice, really. So to do so, I have prepared a few slides that I'm just gonna share with you in a minute. I'm going to show you a trailer to the film that I have been working to document this process. So let's give it a try.
In December 2011, the new Color.net was launched. It is a website of an American company, ACI, specialized in the field of applied chemistry and based in Pennsylvania.
Can you hear the
sound?
sound?
On the site, the company announces that starting from now, our common concepts of color have become outdated due to their breakthrough invention of a previously undiscovered color that doesn't have anything in common with all the colors and shades that we know of.
Here we are, the lab of Lehigh University, taking a peek at the new color. Wow. And you can just see already, just from even though it's still in the flask, the camera's just not able to register this thing at all. I'm going to do a little test so we can take off the cap and pour it out into a dish. You'll see what I'm talking about. And the thing about this stuff is the camera is just not able to register the non-RGB values at all. Here, watch it come out. And you see. Now I'll tell you, do you guys ever hear this? This stuff, it looks fantastic. It's like nothing else that I've ever seen before. It's just not registering at all.
The company claims that their team of leading expert chemists created a structure that reflects visible light waves with unique vibrational frequencies. However, there's a big challenge with the applications in digital media. It is because the displays of modern devices and the image sensors of digital cameras are yet incapable of displaying and reproducing the Magnachrome due to their additive color model, RGB. This is the only reason why the color isn't being shown on the site.
We want people to be creative with this. We want people to investigate its potential, defining what sort of psychological impact it has. We want to see it develop its own resonance and connotation history, which is only just now beginning.
Starting from now, our common concepts of color have become outdated. We have discovered a brand new color, a color that doesn't have anything in common with all the colors that we're used to. We have presented it to several people across the world and asked them to give their first impressions.
It's something you need to experience. I mean, a new color, who would have thought? This is beyond what I anticipated, and I'm just thankful, and it's beautiful.
What do you say when you've been introduced to something that you've never seen before? This is a color that's outside what the human eye is used to seeing, and all I know is that from now on, the art and design world and just the visual world in general is going to be completely revolutionized.
C'est une expérience assez particulière. On n'a vraiment ni à faire un rouge ou un bleu.
Please forgive me. I'm going to skip ahead here, just in order to respect the time and you know, and a little bit of other things that I wanted to talk about. But basically, you know, like in this little trailer, it ends, and the film also ends with the fact that, you know, this company has actually never existed, but at the same time it became an incredible phenomena on the internet. The amount of emails I've started receiving on this fictional company's mailbox was absolutely incredible to me at the time. I would receive emails from institutions and research centers, from journalists and investors, all of them inquiring about the new color and how is it that it can be potentially seen, or how is it can be applied and involved in various projects, such as this funny email that you can see on the right hand side here, which is from a lady called Ankita from the research lab based in Cambridge, in which she's inquiring to have an interview call with me, or a funny email like this one on the left hand side. When I'm going to read it out loud. When will this new color be online to see? Is it a green color? Is it true that Chris Anderson, a professional basketball player, has a tattoo of this color? A few more. So I've later published a book with these emails and have been showing this work as a film and this kind of installation as it had been seen in the first slides that I was showing. I'm going to skip a few more things and actually jump into perhaps a little bit more actual things. So another work that I wanted to talk about today is called the URL Stone, and this is the work that was made in 2015. And I think if I was to do this work now, it would have probably been a very different work in which I would use blockchain technologies. But I'm going to get to the blockchain technologies in a bit with the more recent work. But this work, the URL Stone, the idea of this work was to make. So it began with me, trying to make this investigation about the longevity of media carriers, and juxtaposing one against the other, and taking, perhaps one of the most ancient ways of preserving knowledge, such as this Roman plaque on which I engraved the link. The link itself that had been engraved on the stone sort of leads to the Wikipedia, leads to the file of this very image file of this very stone, but stored on the Wikimedia server. And Wikimedia server is a server where all of the sort of Wikipedia Commons is called, is a project, a side project by Wikipedia, in which all the imagery and video that are used to illustrate all the articles on Wikipedia are stored. So the whole idea and the whole point of doing this was to, thank you, Lev, was to really to kind of to juxtapose a very old way of preserving knowledge against the, at the time, perhaps a very sort of common and a very modern one, to see which of the media carriers survives longer. And okay, given that I only have 5 minutes left, as Lev is signaling to me, I'm going to really try and skip ahead and talk about the very, very new things, and things that have been reactionary since our panel is such a reactionary one. In a way, I'm going to also kind of focus on this conversation. So in March this year, I had a solo show scheduled with my gallery in Berlin. And and as we all remember vividly, I guess, when the war broke out in late February. I mean, I don't like to say that the war broke out, really. In fact, we have the war has been going on for years, right? But when this kind of official claim was made, and this kind of full-scale invasion began, I obviously, all my plans for this show were scrapped immediately. I didn't feel like doing anything that was not related, especially in a city like Berlin, one which has so many of this kind of very thick political layers and narratives to the city itself and to its history. So I've begun really doing this kind of almost improvised, rushed work in which turned out into a series of, I think, quite funny, hardware, software, and apps activism experiments. And this is one of these works. It's called Decentralized Embargo. And the idea of this work was so it began with me looking into what was the kind of the major point of the conversation in Germany related to war, especially in Berlin, was the fact that Germany is heavily dependent on Russian gas as an infrastructural necessity. And having lived in Austria for long enough, I knew quite well that the electricity market in Central Europe works in funny ways where well, to me as a Russian person, it seems a very funny way, where you sign up a contract with a company that provides you with the electricity. And there are companies on the market that actually provide electricity by burning Russian gas. So what they do is they buy enormous amount of gas, they burn it in their facilities. So the process of burning it spins the turbine, which eventually creates the electricity that is then supplied to the customers of the company. So what we did is we set up this incredibly advanced custom-built server rig, which is technically on the level of supercomputer because it has 4 highest end NVIDIA GPUs. And it is all liquid cooled with this custom system that we have built. And so basically, it began with me. I'm going to skip to some slides to narrativize it better. But what I did is I asked the gallery to cancel the contract with their existing supplier and to begin the new contract with the company that is called Energie Baden-Württemberg. It's a German company which is well known for buying Russian gas and being one of the largest sub companies of clients of Gazprom Germania, which is a sub company to a sister company to Gazprom. Which you can see on the left-hand side here of this picture. So we set up this machine there and began basically the mining process. So we started mining Ethereum cryptocurrency, a process, an incredibly, a process which is incredibly heavy on the electricity consumption, by which Ethereum tokens are being generated, which can be then sold at the market price. And here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a screenshot of a tweet, which is an official tweet by the government of Ukraine, in which they list their Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Tether USDT addresses for cryptocurrency donations. So what we did essentially is we just set up this machine to mine Ethereum by consuming and by using electricity, which is essentially being produced by burning Russian gas inside Germany, to then immediately send all of the gains, all of the crypto mining gains, to the official address of the government of Ukraine, by which sort of creating this this twist and this distorted feedback loop of this kind of perverse economy in which, on one hand, Germany supports Ukraine with heavy arms, but at the same time continues to buy gas, which obviously creates a lot of hypocrisy in the conversation, in the public discourse around. And maybe very quickly, I'm just going to show a few more slides of one other piece that was made as part of this show, which really is much more of an activist piece, perhaps, than what I would usually do as an artist. And here we have teamed up with a team of blockchain devs, developers, who were actually doing a lot of interesting work within the Ethereum Foundation, with which I have been working for the past, cooperating for the past 6 years. And so with a group of people, we started elaborating on the idea which I had, which was born through a series of conversations that we had with people at Bellingcat back in 2018, when I think it was 2018 when they received Golden Nika at Ars Electronica. We had this idea of like, we talk so much about validation of facts and these kind of things of open source investigation, and how is it that we can combat fake news and misinformation. And this kind of conversation is especially relevant today, given that we see how efficient this misinformation and propaganda techniques are, especially those used by Russia, but not only by Russia. And we also see this kind of rise of Telegram groups or Telegram channels in which have become this weird zones of gray reporting, which are sort of news outlets, but not really, and they don't really hold any legal obligations to whatever they're reporting as compared to official media channels. And so the idea was to build this blockchain camera, which would record the metadata of any recorded material directly into the blockchain at the time of recording, and it would also take the actual file of this of whatever image of footage file, and split it into tiny chunks of data, tiny chunks. So like I'm talking like 4 kilobits chunks of data that would be stored in something that is called today decentralized storage. So one of the famous examples of decentralized storage projects is Filecoin, but perhaps a little more interesting one is the one called Swarm, which has been born as part of the Ethereum Foundation network. So we partnered with these people in Swarm and with other software developers to kind of look into how is it that we can actually do it. If we have a camera that is connected to the internet, nothing technically stops us from building this very kind of building the software in a very simple way, or maybe on a sophisticated way as well, because there is different levels to complexity as to how good you can actually do it, and how good can you actually make this data to be accessible for potential future open source investigation. And here is we can see this close-up picture in which we see a camera that is built on the Raspberry Pi, which is an open source a mini computer platform with another open source Sony sensor attached to it, to which we have this kind of series of lenses attached. That can be technically used in such setup, but it can also be an app which we have built. And the project is called Hashdogs. And really, this is something that kind of we continue to be working on and building in conversation with people like Forensic Architecture and also a curatorial collective in Berlin called Tactical Tech. Lev signaled me that I'm massively over time already. So so I thank you very much for your time, and I'm just going to provide the stage to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Igor. And I'm sorry, but I have to be in the position of some kind of Soviet censor who's like stifling the avant-garde artist. And you are one of my most favorite artists working today, and definitely one of the top people working with technology. So I wish I can listen to you for the next 2 hours, but we have to move on. So I will introduce Arseniy Zhilayev, our next speaker, and actually say also a couple of extra words of my own, because I'm extremely interested in what he's going to say. So Arseniy was born in 1984 in Voronezh, Russia, and is now based in Venice. His projects examine the legacy of avant-garde museology and museum in the philosophy of Russian Cosmism, using the exhibition as a medium. His works have been shown at numerous prestigious venues, including Guangzhou Biennale, Liverpool, Lyon, Manifesto 13, and Ljubljana Triennale, Center Pompidou, Palace de Tokyo, and basically who is who in contemporary art. He also publishes articles in places like eFlux and Moscow Art Magazine. And he is also the editor of anthology, Avant Garde Museology, published by eFlux, University of Minnesota Press in 2015. And before I give him, the microphone, I want to say that normally we don't think of a museum as particularly avant-garde place. And when we think about historical avant-garde, let's say from Impressionism to, to conceptual art of 1960s or 1920s, if you want, Monero, we don't think about museum as a part of it. And yet it was. Not many of you know, but the first museum of modern art, the first museum of contemporary avant-garde art was not MoMA, which opened in New York in 1929, but the Museum of Pictorial or Painterly Culture, which opened in Moscow in 1918, which was run by artists who is who of Russian, Russian, Jewish, Ukrainian avant-garde, Kandinsky, Malevich, Tatlin, and so on. And these artists came up with a completely new idea for a museum, and in fact used new ideas of contemporary art as also a way to organize installations in this museum, not based necessarily on history, but based on a kind of visual contrast using principles of modern art. And this is just one of many examples, and I think maybe nobody has researched it as much as Arseny, so I welcome him to our stage.
Thank you, Lev, for your introduction, and thank you to organizers for having me here and to the audience. I have one technical question. Shall I use my screen for my presentation? And I'm going to speak today about digitalization as a means for mastering of time. It is not talk about museology, but it's talk about Valerian Muravyov project on mastering of time and technical, getting technical resurrection. And as soon as Valerian Muravyov is associated with Cosmism, with Russian Cosmism, and this is my first public speech since the war in Ukraine has started. I guess it's important to give very, very short introduction to the topic of Russian Cosmism, because everything that is related to Russia today is under suspicion, and this is very understandable. And I just want to say that in case of Russian Cosmism, we have a theory which is principally against war and anti-nationalistic theory. So the very term Russian Cosmism appeared in 1970 as a kind of umbrella term for a set of theories that had appeared before the proletarian revolution, and it was for the first time mentioned in Philosophical Encyclopedia in the footnote section dedicated to Vladimir Vernadsky, famous philosopher, thinker, and geologist. And the logic of Soviet system of knowledge and Soviet philosophy did not give any opportunity for other way of thinking. Nevertheless, Cosmism in some aspects quite close to Marxism, and some important figures, even Vernadsky himself, of course, used to work in Soviet Union and did a lot of things for development of knowledge there. But in order to mark the place of birth and make strict definition between Soviet right philosophical ideas and something else which is related to the context, but historically appeared earlier, this word in the term appeared. So it has nothing to do with nationalism, etc., but it kind of product of the context. And then what is even more important, the main idea of Cosmism is reaching immortality, and immortality that would be real immortality, not mystical, not speculative, but real immortality by means of technology. And then reaching technologies that would lead to full resurrection and returning of all creatures that passed away in our world, with a further resettlement of them in outer space as soon as possibly our planet is not enough for such a full-scale project. And of course, war is the main medium for destruction, the main medium for death, and of course, it's one of the main enemy for cosmist theoreticians. And so-called father of Russian Cosmism, Fedorov, wrote many articles dedicated to possible redistribution of army budgets towards research and technologies that would lead to prolongation of life and to healing and resurrection, etc., etc. So I guess it's quite clear, and we should keep this in mind speaking about these particular things in relation to Russian Cosmism and the Russian context today. But I would like to speak about Valerian Muravyov, who is a relatively unknown figure, philosopher, publicist, and representative of scientific branch of Cosmism that used to work in the late 19th century and the first quarter of 20th century. And in a nutshell, his main idea was to use contemporary for him technology for finding at least theoretical possibilities for real resurrection. And he found it with the help of sets matrix theory by Georg Cantor and Bergson philosophy. So I just mentioned this very shortly and then returned to his idea in the end. Muravyov suggests full-scale digitalization of the world, because our world in its essence is based on digits, on numbers, and these numbers could be accumulated in different types of systems, different types of sets. And when you have the full number of sets, you may reconstruct different moments in development of one or another system. This sounds for me quite close to what we have in case of possible speculation about digital immortality. Perhaps some of us know that today we have even apps for our phones that collect data, collect traces of our life, in order to build after our death a digital copy of our digital activity. And at least in this way, today is a kind of bot, we may already think about digital immortality. But I will return to this later. And now I want to connect Muravyov's ideas not only with the cosmism, the connection, I guess it's clear, but I'd like to connect it with the second part of our topic, which is avant-garde, historical avant-garde, and try to contextualize his ideas in things that possibly more understandable and more known in English-speaking world. So last decade of his life, Muravyov spent in Central Institute of Labor run by Gastev. And here we have a beautiful schema by Gustav Klutz's famous avant-garde artist. And this schema describes principles for the scientific organization of labor. And this we have some paragraphs on the activity of the institute, and the cover by Alexander Gastev. If you'd like, you might read, and I just shortly describe it in shorter. So Gastev was a proletarian poet, very good, very innovative, but as many his colleagues among product cult, I will speak about this later in relation to Bogdanov and Arbatov. So product cult was a part of historical avant-garde, but let's say more democratic and based on full rejection of previous heritage of bourgeois classes, etc., etc. But as many colleagues of him, after the proletarian revolution, Gastev decided to abandon classical institutional territory of art and start doing something particular, something more related to real life production. And in some senses, the Institute of Labor was his main artistic project. So what was the idea? The idea was in optimization of labor actions, that a human body, human mind, and condition of labor should be fully automized, and finally we may get sort of set of cybers with the bodies as machines that can work together and liberate through this automation, through this optimization, liberate proletariat. So this is in a few words the idea. But what was important for me that he was clear in depicting this transformation, that institutional territory of art is not enough, that we must transcend the borders between art and life, art and production. And in this movement, he of course was quite close to general impulse of Kosmism and general impulse of Marxists like, for instance, Boris Arbatov, who was as well part of Prolet Cult movement and worked together with Eisenstein and did a lot of very interesting things. But here I'd like to mention his name because of productivism and the productivist movement. That was movement of artists and constructivists who didn't want to associate themselves with art anymore, but consider themselves as a kind of engineers. And the main idea was that art should be absorbed into production. And as soon as I don't have enough time, I will go further to the figure of Bogdanov. I need 20 minutes, 22 maximum. Bogdanov.
No, Arseny, you can't have 22 minutes because the panel 8 ends in 18 minutes, and Joshua needs to have his 15 minutes, and we discussed it. I'm very sorry, but you don't have. Yeah, you only have 4 minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay. So Bogdanov was, just to explain the logic there, Bogdanov was the figure that stands behind the the whole project of Pralet Cult, and in some senses Gastev project as well, because he was a theoretician of tectonics theory that was a kind of proto-cybernetics based on the ideas of organizational management theory that finally should lead to a full unification of world and kind of ideal organizational structure. And in my opinion, what Muravyov did, he radicalized the ideas of Bogdanov, Arvatov, and Gastev. He decided not only concentrate on the gesture of optimization of labor, but do some sort of ontologization of this optimization and consider each action in the world, each event in the world as a kind of fight against chaos, a fight against entropy. And finally, with at least in theory, finally, when we fully describe and collect all the data and describe them in digits, we will have the situation like in chemistry, when we may repeat one or another action. Of course, this is quite deterministic theory, and we understand that there is no set of sets, there is no matrix of matrix, but I guess we are moving towards this direction, and this is very interesting. And finally, I just show you two pictures from my with a colleagues project under the name of Institute for Mastering of Time. It calls the memetic, and we tried to do some sort of a speculative history of future art that based on this type of sets, this type of matrix, but not optical as we have in neural networks and transformers, but on conceptual gestures. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Arseny, and I will apologize for the rest of my life for cutting it short, okay. But that's the time we have, and we didn't get the museum, but I'm sure everybody is going to rush and read your articles because the stuff is just fascinating. So Joshua, I also apologize. I'm going to introduce you very briefly, so you'll have extra 1 minute to talk.
Sure.
So I'm not going to read the whole long bio. So Joshua Citarella is a New York-based artist and researcher. Like our previous speakers, he exhibited in all kinds of wonderful places. He has also taught at the School of Visual Arts in New York and Rhode Island School of Design, and served as advisor to Carnegie Mellon University and Tufts University. His work is included in the collections of Stedelijk Museum in the Netherlands, Hood Museum of Art in the US, and other places. Welcome, Joshua. You have a stage.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thank you, Lev, for that introduction. I will be conscious of our time this evening, so I'm just going to dive right into the presentation. I'll share my screen in a moment here. Thanks to Wayne, thanks to Anna for the intro at the top. I'll introduce myself very briefly. Joshua Citarella, I'm an artist and internet culture researcher. I spent 10 years showing in galleries, museums. In the last few years, I've taken an anthropological turn where I'm researching social media, politicization, Gen Z, memetic subcultures, and beginning roughly, let's say, 2018, where I published the first book. Since then, I've written 2 books on the topic. I have a podcast that publishes multiple times a month. I Twitch stream every week. I'm also the director of Do Not Research, which is an arts organization based in New York, but also very much online. And we publish essays, artworks, videos, internet culture research, and all sorts of things. So I'm going to share my screen here, and then we'll start our presentation. Okay, and that seems to be coming through all right. This piece that we're looking at here is a self-portrait. This is some of the work that I used to do. I still conduct my art practice in conjunction with everything else, but a little bit of a foundation so you can understand me as an artist and the particular type of perspective that I have on these topics. This is a 12-foot tableau constructed in Photoshop. It's 8 feet tall, a life-size micro apartment of someone in a dystopian live-work future that forecasts many of the worlds that some of these prepper, libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, memetic subcultures like to speculate about. The following piece here is based off of the group that we'll look at in a moment as I introduce the book, but you see here, in anticipation of climate collapse, is someone who has been prepping inside of his Tesla, which is hermetically sealed in a, this is a real feature in the car, actually. It's called bioweapon defense mode, where if you go through the smart panel, you can turn on a HEPA filter, HEPA, which is built by a military subcontractor. And like many things in this space, it began kind of as a memetic exaggeration. It was a very easy to propagate story. And then in 2015, it was tested, and you can, no exaggeration, literally survive a military grade bioweapon by staying inside of your car. Spooky, but very real. Immensely detailed scenes based on the stories that these Gen Z memetic subcultures like to tell to each other. Some degree is real, some degree is fiction, and our job is to tease apart the two. This is the second book that I wrote on the topic. You may recognize this meme as the political compass. We have a spectrum of left to right, authoritarian to libertarian, rather simple diagram, but we'll talk a bit more about this later in the presentation. This book in particular is called 20 Interviews, and I think this is really some of the only material that's been published as a firsthand primary source. In this book, I'm speaking to Gen Z meme posters between the ages of 15 to 20. This project happened about 2 years later, so the median age of these subcultures has drifted upwards about 2 years. More so in 2018, when I published the first book, you would find people among the ages of 12 and 13 was not uncommon to be posting in this space. And so across this book, there's 20 very lengthy interviews asking people to describe the world that they expect to unfold within their young lifetimes. You know, when they're about maybe the age of some of us on this panel, what do they expect the world, society, government, politics, climate to be like? And you have all sorts of perspectives from the ideological spectrum of ultra-leftism, paleoconservatism, anarcho-primitivism, which we'll talk about a bit later, transhumanism, which is maybe in relation to the Russian cosmos that we just heard about, pan-constitutional monarchism, really all over a very wide Overton window. This is a screenshot from the first book, actually, and I want to show this just as a demonstration of the types of accounts that are participating in this discourse. Immensely, immensely detailed, neat political ideology as a form of niche personal branding, and really people staking out contrarian positions that sometimes are very fascinating and sometimes are totally ridiculous and made up. But yeah, quite in depth and really wide Overton window in this space. I'm just going to read out a few of these to demonstrate how niche these things actually get as an intro to this subculture we're about to talk about, but you begin with relatively popular, well-known political affiliations such as Bernie Sanders or the Green Party or Jeremy Corbyn, and then they become increasingly niche. We see fully automated luxury communism, mutualism, Trotskyism, and then towards the bottom, there's things that you may or may not have heard about, such as Possadism and John Zerzan, who is the intellectual godfather of anarcho-primitivism, which becomes very influential in this space, peaks around 2018. So this is the book. This is the final version that was published in 2021. The first one came out in 2018, which was really only circulated to artists, but then an anonymous meme poster got a hold of the book, scanned it, put it on Discord, and my life and practice changed significantly ever since, as all the people in the book then had literally annotated around the book to give their feedback about. In my defense, I got things, I think, very accurate, but just people are salty about having their memes printed and they want to give their version of the story. But since then, I've conducted lengthy interviews with a lot of the people involved, published books with them, done numerous collaborations, brought people for a panel at the New Museum. We flew in some Gen Z meme posters, which I still maintain relationships with. And yeah, in general, my, I think, depiction of the space is broadly agreed upon by most of the people who are in it. Yeah, I think as the last note that I'll say here is that being for most of my career the youngest person in the room trying to explain how social media and networked communications and whatnot are going to transform the world. In this particular instance, I'm now 35 years old. I'm not sure if I'm mid-career, but I'm no longer emerging. And being in communication with these young meme posters is quite a upends a lot of your assumptions. So keep in mind their age as compared to us. And I'll give a brief intro to the community. So in this book in 2018, it plots the arc of radicalization for people who are broadly interested in left-wing politics, all sorts of different affiliations. But I'm going to read a brief excerpt from the book here that I think encapsulates a lot of the ideology that becomes present at the time. And in this search, what I found were vibrant and surprisingly active communities of the post-left, anti-civilization eco-anarchist groups scattered across various chat servers. Their style is witty and cutthroat, radically inclusive, multicultural, LGBTQ, pro-diversity, posting 24 hours a day at the speed of 4chan. Quote, race, class, gender is a social construct, and we must do away with all of it. They reject traditional strategies of collective bargaining and coalition building. Anything other than dismantling civilization is only a temporary stopgap, which by design cannot hold back the brutal efficiency of capitalist acceleration. My time studying this space seems to indicate and correspond with a broader trend of young ideologues and activists losing faith with the goals of the old left: better jobs, higher wages, equality, or generally any meaningful improvement to their material well-being. Our failure to present a compelling vision of the future is currently losing the younger generation to nihilism. For the second year in a row, life expectancy in the United States has dropped. Cue the post-left. It has to get worse before it gets worse. So this is an ultra-pessimistic demographic of Gen Z meme posters, mostly concerned with imminent climate collapse as the thing that eviscerates previous political assumptions from the earlier generations. So to give a bit more of a rigorous definition of what they think rather than a meme version of it, I'll just say here that in a traditional Marxist sense, we would say that alienation arises with industrial capitalism from wage labor and the commodity form. The post-left, as that subculture identified itself at the time, they would argue that alienation begins even earlier with agrarian societies and labor specialization. They're going to argue that our inability to be self-sufficient has alienated us from our own nature, our environment, and essentially domesticated the human being. These are very anarchist politics that reject industrial society. Their ideal formation of human civilization, society rather than civilization, just to abide by their terminology. What they prefer is a band of nomadic hunter-gatherers living off the natural abundance of the land. They frequently talk about imminent ecological disaster and the necessity for degrowth. So taken in context, I think these are important things to remember the age group of the people who are posting here. And to take that into account for why they feel so alienated in the field of technology. So I'm going to condense my argument here to, I think, 3 core claims that emerging memetic subcultures are something between a folk art and possibly a new avant garde. And I think in general, we've seen the avant garde has disappeared from capital A art. And this corresponds to a larger political history of the 20th century that is complex, but I think important to consider in this context. So number one is, I think, very simple, is that there's a shared aesthetic vocabulary. There's a unified set of signs and characters shared across political divisions, actually. So to say that these are left-wing or right-wing movements, it's actually the competition for what those symbols mean in the public consensus that incentivizes different groups to try and engage in semiotic or memetic warfare to associate this particular symbol with this particular group. So fantastic example of this, the classic, is that Pepe, synonymous with 4chan and far-right politics, then later appears in the Hong Kong protests as an anti-authoritarian symbol. So my claim would be that I think this at least forms a tradition of image making. Perhaps it's some type of an artistic movement, but the shared aesthetic vocabulary, I think, is essential to considering this new emergent movement on social media. The second is, I think, that a very simple definition of the avant-garde, but it's important to return to these first principles every now and then, is that they press against the barriers of the medium or the technology itself. There's an intentional overuse of the tools that then forces you to look at all other works in that medium in a different way. So while Instagram may appear to be advertising and influencers and brunch and this type of like brand building, meme culture looks like this, and it's hideous, and they're deep fried, and they're very rough, and they force you to break the diegetic space of advertising that exists simultaneously in this news feed. Rather straightforward, but important to emphasize the strategic overuse of the tool, cranking up the contrast and things like this. The third, which is I think essential, is that meme culture has become a space for radical politics. And this is contrast to a period of relative institutional rigidity, particularly in the United States. And radical memes really pick up during the time of the online culture wars as art institutions drift away from transgression and towards a relative upkeep of the status quo. In the case of the United States, there's a kind of populist drift to the right and to the left, and we saw legacy media and institutions stake out a position in a very untenable, brittle center that seemed to be breaking apart. So what you see crop up in meme cultures is something we call ideologies, which is an internet slang term we use to describe this somewhat arbitrary pairing of prefixes and suffixes to generate complex ideological labels. And some of the things you have here are like libertarian monarchism, individualist transhumanist anarcho-capitalism, Islamo-national Bolshevism, Catholic transhumanist distributism, all sorts of niche ideologies retrofitted as personal branding that crop up in these peculiar corners of the internet. This is part of an ongoing series that I think there's maybe four sets of this now, up to 32 flags, but there are an infinite number of these. So to underline this point, we're seeing a flourishing of the ideologies appear on the internet, while cultural institutions have drifted back to aligning themselves with a center consensus that seems to be increasingly unpopular. So the question that I want to pose, I think, and maybe I have a bit more, but I want to leave time for our discussions and panels afterwards. But if cultural institutions have become relatively more conservative, have we seen maybe a contemporary version of this avant-garde drift to extra institutional spaces, which would be the platforms? And then what is our responsibility as aesthetic experts, as people who want to canonize, contextualize, and understand these spaces better? What is our obligation, and what should we be studying, writing about, and et cetera? But I think to be conscious of the time, maybe I'll allow our moderator to come back, and I'm happy to jump in with some other stuff later on if that's convenient.
Yeah. Joshua, thank you so much. It's fascinating. So I think, sadly, we have to end in about 15 seconds, right, Anna? Or do we have a few minutes? Yes. So
actually, I'm not sure that we have time, so we need to finish this panel.
Yeah, but I'm saying, okay, so we have to finish. Okay, so I personally is going to spend time, reading some of your publications of wonderful presenters. And what I got out of today's panel is that I'm not sure digital art is avant-garde, but we have this new figure of artist and researcher, right? Artists who use art as a kind of research practice, doing research, publishing books, and doing work which is as serious, right, as academic researchers, but having all resources of art. And this is also maybe not completely new, but it becomes stronger. And I think all the three people here are amazing, fascinating, deep, profound representatives of this new artist, research, technology, political issues, let's say avant-garde. And sadly, we have to end, many more conferences, but we live in the age of internet, so you can definitely reach, right, online, to reach your artists and ask them questions directly. And thank you guys so much again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Also, thank you. Thanks to everyone. Right now, I'm trying to understand, do we have any questions from our listeners? But before I'll get the answer, I'd like to mention to our listeners, visitors, that we're going to have the next panel, which is named Intervention, Resistance, Digital Art and Activism. It's going to be after a short break, which is going to last 15 minutes. So don't get offline, stay with us. Just mute if you want some silence. And if you quit, just use the same link to enter the conference again. Oh, yeah. I got the information that we have 10 minutes for questions, if we have any, but I'm not sure which questions do we have, and does anyone know?
I haven't seen any questions on YouTube, but maybe we can use. Maybe we can use. If we have like 5 or 7 minutes, maybe people, because everybody had so much more to say. Maybe if any of our presenters want to add something.
Okay, I think it will be fair. It will be fair. I think.
Yeah. So Igor, Joshua, Arseny, if you kind of want to, if you want to add something or maybe ask each other questions. I already talked too much, so I will shut up. So I was told we do have like 7 minutes.
I could advance a question to the panel, maybe helps to spark things, but I found in preparing for this lecture, I was trying to condense to like 3 very tight points. And the 4th thing that I found myself thinking about, which is a bit more abstract, is that there seems to be a sense of the avant-garde that is beyond just the tools themselves and technological experimentation and what have you, but there's an implication that these artists are preoccupied or desire to advance a specific vision of society, that there's, maybe it's not explicitly political, but it's utopian, or it's a new type of imaginary for the future society. That seems to be a core portion of it. So I wonder maybe if that sparks anything for people, if that feels like too loose of a suggestion, but yeah, being concerned with this future, particularly in a moment given the climate scenario, we are ripe for a return of the avant-garde.
And now we.
Igor, you appear to be muted.
Igor, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
We have already two questions.
Igor wanted something to say. Igor had to have something
you want
to say, no?
To add something, okay?
Igor, you want? We can't hear you for some reason. I'm sorry.
Maybe while we're troubleshooting tech, we could take the first question here. That's just, if I'll read it from the chat. I think this is for me, so I'm going to jump onto it. Is the nihilism pre-existing or maybe spawned in social media because of the extreme focus on predominantly negative emotion as fuel? And is this leaking into the real world? So I think this is referring to, optimizing social media for continued use on the platform, and that spurs a lot of sensation and outrage and divisive ideas and so that tints politics in a certain way where people get into flame wars and what have you. I think there's a certain portion of that, but that is broadly, I think everyone's experience is a little bit negative or exhausted in the news cycle. But I think in relation to the younger demographic, I'm inclined to be sympathetic that they have this very negative outlook, and I'm not sure that it behooves us to backpedal or to sugarcoat some of the political or climate realities that they're going to be facing in, say, 20 years or 40 years' time. Because in some cases, the worst calibrations are not totally inaccurate. We don't have to be doomsayers about it, but it is important to confront as a serious matter. And I would say that this is essentially the purpose of media in general, that narratives that are not represented in mainstream institutions then crop up as alternative publications, periodicals, newsletters for political dissidents, and so on and so forth. And this is a necessary part of producing the discourse, that if there's a consensus lacking amongst the experts, then people move to extra institutional spaces to propagate different narratives.
I wonder if you can hear me now.
Hey,
Yeah,
yes.
yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, Joshua, I was actually just trying to react to your earlier statements and kind of trying to sort of to make this kind of topology of, you know, what is it that constitutes avant-garde. And I've actually had this little note written before the lecture. I never before this panel, but I never really got to read it out loud. I'm gonna use this chance now. It goes as: avant-garde historically has been preoccupied with revealing and challenging existing power structures and mass culture, largely produced by industrialization. Today's conditions suggest a similar potential for artistic liberation from old models of power and the birth of new ways of representation of reality and objects. I think this is maybe this is too optimistic of a thing to say, because we also have, you know, a huge amount of issues to deal with today, aren't we? At the same time, you know, if we kind of, you know, many of us here are actually of Russian origin, and to us, looking at avant-garde is kind of has historically been very closely tied to, you know, to the phenomena of revolution of 1970s, of the Great October Revolution, we call it. So the way in which, at least I was told, you know, by people who would teach me history of art really back at Rodchenko School, was that you know, avant-garde was largely Russian avant-garde was largely a product of the revolution, right? So it's kind of, you know, trying to go back to your point, I think it really is overlapping. There are so many things that have to come together for avant-garde to emerge, right? The certain industrialization, the certain liberation that may be achieved through industrialization, which is maybe we have now, you know, given that we live in this kind of condition of, you know, what some people call as, people like Benjamin Bratton, for example, would call as the fourth industrial revolution. But at the same time, you know, are we able to sort of dismantle the power structures that we have today? I think I'm pretty sure you've been largely preoccupied with this FTX crash Twitter saga and this disaster in which we kind of see that, you know, at least according to many sort of you know, speculative proposals and sort of conspirologists around it, that you know so much of this things that we believe in as potential tools for you know sort of liberation of certain power structures, like economical power structures, being taken away from us in front of us, you know, just kind of being dismantled and played and sort of manipulated in ways that only reinforce existing political structures, right? In this case, in the discourse of crypto, this would be central banks, obviously, right, versus sort of DeFi and you know, and various protocols. Yeah, I hope it makes sense. I think I was carried away a little bit, but yeah, I just wanted to react to what you said earlier.
Thank you. And we have another question from Robert Richardson. He's asking, Fluxus explored the whole art versus life duality. Is it still relevant? And it's also about having fun. He doesn't mention to whom he asks, so who's gonna answer? Do you hear me?
Yes, we heard.
Okay, so is there anyone who can maybe answer to his question?
I'm not sure if I have great context for it, but I think maybe implicit in this and also Egger's contribution is that there's a portion of just political history, political economy that then shapes the conditions under which art is made. And when I think of Fluxus as compared to the opportunities to navigate a creative career of someone who's, say 19 or 20, then it's a very different scenario. And yeah, maybe in a moment of if this is something like a fourth industrial revolution, maybe machine learning is so transformative and AI shifts the way that our network communication structures work with each other to such a dramatic degree that those create the formative conditions for a new avant-garde to emerge. Totally possible. But I find I think generally I'll make this very brief, but like in a lineage of art in the American context, particular, which is the context that I know, I feel like the idea of the baton pass through history, artists referencing each other, that feels to me more or less like it's falling apart with the something related to a general broad consensus of delegitimized institutions in the United States. So the history that they espouse in reference to the art canon is being overturned, right, with a different political lens. As we look back, we see museums deaccessioning old collections in favor of diversifying their collection. There's a lot of the historical assumptions seem to be being reevaluated at the moment. So yeah, I think it's difficult to analogize to different periods right now because we're in a transformational time. But I'll leave it at that because I know we're limited for time now.
Thank you for your answer. I think that we have only 1 minute left before the break. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for everyone, for the speakers, for the moderator, for our listeners. We're gonna have a break in 15 minutes. Please get back to your screens and like for this quarter of hour, please take a rest and we're gonna wait you here again. Thanks to everyone. Don't miss us, don't leave us, stay with us. In 15 minutes, remember.
This is the sound of space. Performance is happening exactly where you are.